Thank you, Andy. See how this goes. I'm not real versed in none of these things, but anyhow, we'll give it a go. I wanted to talk about weed and grass control from a lot of different perspectives. So we'll kind of get into it. And if you've got any questions, feel free to bring it up at any time you want, and we'll try to address it. But we looked at a lot of different methods of weed and grass control in vineyards. Part of it is going to be hand weeding, and at least in the early lives of the vineyard, that may be a lot more than you'd like, but there's not a lot of options then. Mechanical weed and grass control involves things like mowing or tillage, flaming, and then chemical weed control, and we'll spend more time on that than anything else. And chemical weed control is used quite a bit because if you look at all the costs, it's probably going to be for at least a commercial grower the least expensive way to control grasses and weeds, the fastest way to do it, and if it's done correctly, it's one of the safest ways to go about it too. So we're going to explore some of the different techniques that we use and some of the intricacies on those. But first off, what is a weed? And a weed is defined as a plant that's growing where it's not wanted, and it's in competition with cultivated plants. It's something you do want. But there are several different types of weeds that we have to contend with. Dicots generally are broadleaf weeds, and they present an entirely different challenge in control as opposed to monocots, which grasses and sedges fall into. We have annuals that will grow and seed out in 1 year and germinate the seed generally either in the following year or the spring. Biennials that will grow vegetatively for a year and then set seed on the second year, and quite often the plant will then die. Good examples of those are thistles and blackberry. And then perennials, which are long-lived, harder to control. They reproduce via seed and can also propagate themselves vegetatively through rhizomes, stones, bulbs, tumors. Things like poison ivy fall into that category. Now, one thing to keep in mind when we start talking about herbicides is that the label is so long. So the label gives you a lot of information, and we're supposed to be responsible for what we do based on what the label says. And so I put up a Chateau label. Chateau is labeled for use in vineyards. It's labeled for 2 or 3 different types of use, and the information on it pretty much guides us with what we need to do. For example, it's got a pre-emergence application recommendation using 6 to 12 ounces of the herbicide per broadcast acre. Now, that again, the rate is guided by the label. If you're over that, then it's in violation of the label, and supposedly it's they're not liable. It also is used as a post-emergent. We'll define these terms a little later on. But I just wanted to show you some of the information on the label, and in this case, it also gives you a recommendation under the post-emergent for an adjuvant, a surfactant. That we'll talk about that in a bit too. Other information on the label, precautions. Here we have a 60-day pre-harvest interval. The statement not to apply to grapes unless that have been established less than 2 years, unless they are trellised and are up, so that you're not going to run the risk of getting herbicide up onto them. And in many cases, we're talking about protection of the trunk in that first year or 2 of their life. And that can be either through the use of a physical guard, or in some cases it can be the use of paint. But what we need to do on some of these plants is protect the trunk so that we actually don't get herbicide up there. If this information is on the label, then there's if you're using it, you're responsible for that information. Now, in Tennessee as a whole, our vineyard management system that we talked about is going to be a bare strip underneath the vines, and generally this strip is going to be anywhere from 3 to 4 feet in width. And the reason for that is we want to reduce the competition for moisture and nutrients, especially with young vines. Also, and then we'll use a vegetative strip between rows. And now here we're looking at ideally a vineyard that is oriented across the slope. So a lot of our land is sloping land. If I was on a flat field, I would run my rows north and south because you intercept more sunlight that way. But due to the erosion potential that we run into with ground management, if I'm on a slope, I'm going to run those rows across the slope regardless of what direction or what orientation we have. But the vegetative strip between rows serves as a deceleration and diffusion strip to run off water. And with a lot of our soils are very erodible, and this is quite important. Uh, it also serves to support the equipment and for the people that are working out there. And this becomes quite important, especially in the spring of the year. We're putting out sprays at a lot of times when the ground conditions are not very favorable to have equipment out there. We have a lot of rain, or it could be raining at the time we're spraying. So you've got to have, hopefully, you've got to have support for the equipment so you don't run up the field or get stuck out in the middle of the field. And also with good vegetative strips, you're reducing soil compaction from that equipment and increasing the organic matter in those sod strips. And eventually the grapevine root system will get out there. Now they may go down when the grapevine roots go out and meet that vegetative strip. The tendency of the root system is to go down and then back out once the competition with that sod becomes less. But that vegetative strip is fairly important. The actual width of the strip is somewhat negotiable depending on the distance between rows and the equipment that you have to take care of your vineyard. You know, if you have a lot of land to get over and time is always tight, it may well be that you want to match the width of that vegetative strip to the width of your mower so that you can go down through and make one pass down the row and clean up everything. So the actual width will vary a little bit on condition, but the concept is going to be the same. As far as ground covers, what's the preference? The sod versus whatever comes up. A lot of our vineyards use natural vegetation. That is, in many cases, if the field that we planted in was in good shape, we may go in and kill out a strip where the row will be, but we'll leave the native vegetation in the row middle. That may be okay, but it may not be the best option that we have. One of the things that we encounter is a lot of our broadleaf weeds in the alternate host for insects and diseases and viruses that can affect the grapevine. And so our tendency, if we had the ideal scenario, we would destroy our broadleaf weed populations and establish a good non-competitive sod in the row middle. Grasses are much better from that standpoint than our broadleaf weeds as far as being alternate hosts of flowers. But we need to find the ideal sod too. Where we do introduce grasses, a lot of times in our vineyards and orchards, it's going to be fall fescue. Fall fescue's got a lot of good points. It's also got some very strong negative points. The good points, we need a sod that's easy to establish and to maintain. It's going to stay with it, that will tolerate traffic. Now, fescue certainly does that, but then it starts to break down. It's overly vigorous. Competition from fescue is a lot stronger than we'd like. What we would prefer would be to have something that went semi-dormant to dormant during the summer months so that you didn't have a lot of mowing to do and you didn't have a lot of competition for the moisture and nutrients from the sod strip. Also, we want to have a sod that will help us control voles. One of the problems we run into with fescue, tall fescue, is that it will support a breeding population of voles. And at some point during the year, depending on surroundings, but vole populations can build, and when their natural food supply becomes limited, then they may turn to woody plants. and that's where the problem starts. So we would like to have a full or a sod that does not support the full population so that we don't have this bigger risk. Even with that, we need to monitor for bull presence and be prepared to take measures if the populations get up. And then the final thing we put in here is we would like to have a sod that's easily controlled by herbicides. Now, fall fescue does have that advantage. It is controlled, but it's too strong. And so we're looking at things like creeping red or some of the turf type fescues that look like they've got a lot more promise in that they're not as vigorous. You're not going to spend as much time mowing them. They're not as competitive, and they will not support that bull population. A little bit of terminology when we get into herbicides. First off, what is an herbicide? And it's defined as a substance that's toxic to plants, and we use it to destroy unwanted vegetation. There are a lot of different types of herbicides, and we will use pre-emergent herbicides. Those are put down on top of the ground, and when a weed seed germinates, it basically intercepts the seedling at the soil level and kills it out. It does not prevent that weed seed from germinating. But and then for weeds that are actively growing, we have our post-emergent herbicides. That is herbicides that we use to kill weeds that are growing. And within that, we have a couple different types. The selective herbicides will go after specific weeds and are not that big a risk to other vegetation. One of the examples of that is Post or Fusilade or Select are pretty good grass materials, strictly grass. And they're selected for grasses. You can use them in the vineyard without really worrying about damage to the grapevine. Other post-emergent herbicides are non-selective, and they'll work against a wide range of vegetation. Dromoxone, for example, is non-selective. It'll kill whatever's green, including your grapevine if it should happen to get on the green tissue. But because of the nature of the way that we use it, it can be used quite safely. Glyphosate or Roundup is also non-selective. But it's one that offers a bigger threat to us than say, something that drops the dromoxone. Dromoxone is a true contact herbicide. It kills what it gets on, and that's it. It doesn't go any further. Whereas glyphosate is also contact, but it is absorbed by plant tissue and translocated to the root system. And at certain times of the year, the more mature the plant that the glyphosate is sprayed on, the more will be translocated to the roots, and therefore the more dangerous glyphosate becomes to the grapevine. And so we'll talk a little bit about the use of glyphosate in the vineyard in just a bit. And it's one that has a real place, but it also presents some real danger. Another couple terms that we want to look at are adjuvant and surfactant. An adjuvant is a substance that we add to the pesticide, to the herbicide, or to the spray mix to give us better performance out of that pesticide. And it's things like a surfactant, spreader, sticker, a crop oil, anti-foaming materials. These are materials that we use to give us better performance out of the herbicide or fungicide or insecticide. A surfactant is an adjuvant, but it's designed to improve the dispersion or multiplying characteristics of the product to give us better coverage and therefore better uptake. And so some herbicides will have their own surfactant, some do not. And we'll go back to glyphosate as an example. Roundup, the products named Roundup contain a surfactant. Some of the generic glyphosate materials do not. And it should state that on the label. And if you use a generic glyphosate that does not have a surfactant, then you want to add a surfactant to get the performance out of the material. If you've got one that already has it, then you don't want to add more. not a factor of a little bit is good and more is better. Another thing that's important to understand when you get into use of herbicides is the rate per acre versus rate per treated acre. If you look at the labels on some of the herbicides, they're going to talk about, say, Princess 4L, 2 to 4 quarts per acre. What they mean is 2 to 4 quarts per treated acre. And I've run into some situations where that has been misinterpreted, and as a result, we've had some serious herbicide overkill. So if you look at the picture on the left-hand side of the screen, we're treating only a portion of that ground acre with the herbicide. So rate per treated acre, we want to calculate how much of a full acre of ground are we actually treating. So if you're between those spaces 12 feet and the herbicide strip is 4 feet wide, you're actually treating 1/3 of the ground area. And so per acre of ground, you're only treating 1/3 of an acre. Realize that when you look at when you mix up the herbicide and when you put it out, that you take that into account. Otherwise, you could end up overdosing and reduce the stand. Another thing we need to look at is which in our selection of herbicides is the mode of action of the product. I took this slide out of the Small Food Consortium guide, but if you look at the second column, the material, and read down through that, the first thing you see under the common name of the material is MOA, and maybe MOA 3, MOA 20, whatever, but that's the mode of action. And it's important, we'll talk a little bit more about this later on, but this is an important thing to realize so that we don't necessarily do a certain class of chemistry and run into some resistance like we are saying, or that we don't overdo it with that chemistry and hurt the product. I had a situation this past year where a grower used two different brand names of products, but we started seeing some death in the planting. And when we looked at what products to use, when we got down to the active ingredients of the chemistry, both of them had the same mode of action. So basically, he was overdosing. He was way over rate on that herbicide and was seeing plant death as a result. So it's important to realize when you start selecting materials that you select the proper materials to use based on the mode of action as well as what you're going after. I've taken a label and look a little bit at that to see some of the other information on the label. And this is simazine. Simazine is or Princep is a very common pre-emergence herbicide for fruit trees, grapevines. It's a good material. It's good broad spectrum material, and it's one we've been using for the last 50, 60 years that I know of, anyhow. But if you look at this label, this is the 4L or liquid formulation. You can also get Princep in an 80W wettable powder formulation. The labels are going to be a little different. Realize that, and the challenges in putting it out will be a little bit different as well. But realize that a given product may come in 2 or 3 different formulations, and in some cases, different concentrations of the same formula. To make sure you match what you're going to use with the recommendations as far as the product to get the right rate. Okay, this too is on the simazine label. Now, here on grapes, for the 4L formulation of simazine, the recommended rate is 2 to 4 quarts of the product per treated acre. And here is the case where they don't specify it's per treated acre, but it's 2 to 4 quarts per sprayed acre. And it can be used anytime between harvest and early spring. There are better times, and you can get into that in just a bit. Another thing that's on the label are some of the precautions and restrictions. All of the chemicals that we use have it. Here, it says don't use in the vineyard established less than 3 years or crop injury may occur. And again, this goes back to a lot of research developing the product, but also if you use it and got damaged and you were using on some 2-year-old vines or 1-year-old vines, that's your error and your error only, and, because it's on the label. So make sure that you look at the limitations for the product based on the label for that particular material. And the recommendations that we give, and wherever possible, we try to bring those out to re-emphasize them. Moving on, it talks about using it not more than once per calendar year. And again, you can build up that active material to the point that you can do some damage if you use it too frequently at too close to interval. A little bit about application too, because selecting the right material and the right rate is just part of the story. How do you put it out? And normally when we put out herbicides, the sprayer that we use, regardless of whether it's a backpack or a tractor drawn sprayer, we want to make sure that we put it out at the way we can protect the crop as much as possible. So where we have adjustments, we want to put our herbicides out at relatively low pressures. Generally about 20 to 40 pounds per square inch pressure is recommended for herbicides. And the reason for that is we want to have as little drift as possible. We do not want off-target movement of that material. And the higher the pressure, the more potential you have for drift and rebound of that material when it hits the ground, and it could go from the ground back up into the crop you're trying to protect. We want to use large droplet size. Again, larger droplets are not going to move off target as well. And by going at a relatively low pressure, we can do a better job getting the large droplets. We're going to use the gallons per acre that we put down will also have an impact. You usually get the best activity, best results from the herbicides when you're putting it down at about 20 to 40 gallons of spray per treated acre. You can put down a lot more gallonage than we do when we use backpack sprayers a lot, but you're not going to increase your control by putting down more gallons of water per acre. You're just going to make it more difficult to get the best results. And then another thing that we look at are the nozzles that we use on the spray. And for herbicide applications, in most cases, the best nozzle to use is a flat fan nozzle. It works well with low pressures and low volumes. It'll give you a fairly wide band of material and give you fairly uniform distribution of that material in the right conditions. But there are a lot of different types of nozzles out here, and this slide shows the full cone, hollow cone, as well as the flat fan. Hollow cone works well on fungicide applications. We use the full cone on insecticides and fungicides as well. Flat fan is pretty much restricted for weed control. Another thing we want to do is rotate our herbicides. A specific herbicide doesn't control all weeds. So I mentioned earlier that Simazine or Trimsep, is a very good pre-emergent herbicide, and it is, and it covers a broad spectrum of weeds. It does not cover them all. And so if we use Simazine as our primary herbicide and we use it consistently and not rotating, we're going to cultivate resistant weeds. That is, weeds that Simazine either never has control, or because we've used it so much, we've actually developed resistance to that product. So we rotate our materials. or we can't mix on materials. We'll cover that in just a second. But rotating herbicides will give you a better job so that you may move from an herbicide that is, say, weak on grasses, and the next time you use, you're going to be using material that's a little bit stronger on grasses, and so that you don't have lush grass population. If you control most of the weeds in an area, the ones that you don't control are going to do very well. They're going to flourish because you've just taken away a lot of the competition they have for sunlight, moisture, and nutrients. And so by rotating materials, hopefully we're going to get a broader spectrum of grass and weed control, and we're also going to lessen the potential for resistance buildup. And herbicide resistance management is a real consideration. Roundup is a beautiful example of that. You know, Roundup has been a workhorse for us, and for many people, it's been the only herbicide they use in a wide array of crops. As a result, we're now seeing fairly widespread resistance to Roundup on many of our weed species. And here, resistant pigweed was one of the first ones to show up, but there are several other types of weeds and grasses that are very tolerant or resistant to Roundup application now. I was in a peach orchard in Middle Tennessee several years ago, and it was the trees were somewhere in the neighborhood of 7 or 8 years old, and all the trees were dead. And the grower was wondering what was going on. And when we walked into the orchard, the only weeds I saw were pigweed, and they were really abundant. And I asked them what they've been using for herbicide, and it had been Roundup for several years. And I asked them when the last time they used it was, and it was the previous year up in the middle of summer. Well, two problems. One of them is that over the years, they had developed a very resistant population of pigweed to Roundup. They were not controlling it. And because they were controlling a lot of other things, the pigweed was growing very well. It was very aggressive. Because they were putting their Roundup out at the time they were putting it out when the peach tree was the most susceptible to Roundup damage. And the way they were putting it out, they had a lot of off-target movement. And they killed the peach trees and didn't kill the weeds. And, you know, that's an extreme example, but it can happen. And so through the use of both pre-emergent and post-emergent herbicides and rotating into different modes of action, we can protect the life of the herbicides that are available to us and give ourselves better weed control as a result. I took this chart out of the, again, the Small Fruit Consortium guide, and I went to the grape pest control program, but in the weed control part, this chart shows up showing the weed response to various herbicides, and it's meant to be a guide in selecting the best material to use for the situation you might have in your vineyard. So, you know, if you've got issues with crabgrass or foxtail, goosegrass, chickweed, Allion is one of the best materials you can use. But if you, whereas if you use, say, Zeus Prime, which is the last pre-emergence material, it's only fair. So it wouldn't be a good one to look at. However, if you were on over and looking at, say, bush weed control, Lens Quarter, both Allion and Zeus are excellent at that, but Allion falls off under some of the other materials. So you can mix and match based on the materials that to address the weed population you have. Also, we're going to be looking at the time of application. The second material on the pre-emergence is Pasteron. It's a good herbicide, and as you can see, it's rated as good control for a lot of different weeds. However, it's a material that you would not put out during the growing season. Once your soils get up and once your temperatures get up much above 50, it's not a good material to use. So, several factors you look at in selecting it. The same thing is true with post-emergence material. If you've got, again, grasses, look at fusillade, for example, or succulent, post, those are grass materials. They're grass herbicides, and that's all they are. They don't have any broad-leaf activity. But if you've got grasses and the grasses are relatively small, those are a good choice for you to use in your vineyard because they'll work well on the grasses and they also present essentially no threat at all to the crop. So even with those materials, we're going to suggest that we do as good a job directing the spray as we can to keep it off of the vine. But if you should happen to get some drift onto the grapevine with those materials, you're not going to see damage. Contrast that with some other materials that are going to be, paraquat, for example, is going to be excellent on grass control too. It's fast, but it's also excellent on grape control if you happen to spray the vine, the green part on the vine. So use this guide as a way to select materials. There are a lot of decisions to make. And it would be nice if we could have a cookbook where we could say, well, use this material for a pre-emergence at this rate and then add another material to it, and that's all there was to it. And to a certain extent, that's kind of the way it used to be, but it's not that way anymore. There are a lot more options to take into consideration, and we can help you on some of the decisions, but these are things we need to consider when you're trying to look at what's going to be the material for us to use. I took this also out of the small fruit guide, and it's just part of the table. We've used a lot of Roundup or Glyphosate for years and years in vineyards across, every state. Glyphosate has got a place for us, but right now, if we had our choice, I might use glyphosate in a pre-plant situation, that is getting rid of some of the noxious weed situations that you might have where you're going to plant, and a fall application of glyphosate does fairly well. If you've got blackberry in the field and you want to clear it up so you can plant, coming in with glyphosate in the fall is a good way. It takes care of blackberry if you've got your raised side. If you're getting ready to plant, you do your fall treatment. There's nothing to go on in the winter, but in the spring, there are some materials you can use after you got that plant in the ground to take care of some of the vegetation that may come back in that could compete with that young vine. In the guide, Oryzolin, which is also Surfland, is listed. This year, after this guide was printed, actually a factory where they make Surfland blew up, and that's not an option this year anymore. You can't get it. So we're substituting flour as our safer material to use in these young vineyards. But what it's showing here is that if we start to get some vegetation coming in to compete with that new vine, there are some herbicides you can use, but Roundup is not one of them. And on up in the summer, if you've got vegetation issues to control, again, Roundup is not one of the issues, one of the selections. Instead, what we're going to recommend is, depending on the weed population, something that would be good on grasses or broadleaf. Here we had Surfland, which is a good grass herbicide, plus paraquat. The paraquat is a good post-emergence burn-down material. It'll kill what's there. And then the pre-emergence material, which is the Surfland aspect, would intercept any new growth. Gives you a longer control, and you can paint mix these material, put them both out at the same time. Just a caution, if you've got a lot of strong growth, if there's a lot of weed and grass pressure, especially if it's gotten a little on the big side, I would not paint mix. I'd go in with the paraquat and kill back what's there. And after it was killed back, then I had a little bit better opportunity to get a good coverage with pre-emergence on the soil. Then I would come back with the second spray with a good pre-emergence material. You see also fusillade posts or clethodim listed that first year. Again, for grass control, there's safe products to use. You can use them. Actually, on fusillade, I believe the label says on non-bearing vines only. But you can use them that first year, possibly 2 years of the Vineyard's life. There, I don't have, in this slide, got a lot of stuff on it, but this is just the base recommendation that we're using for herbicides over an entire year with grapes and also with several different ages of vines. So what we'll see on this as we move into the growing season, you're going to not see glyphosate in most of these slots, but what you'll see under the spring application is glyphosate coming in. Glyphosate is an entirely different product than glyphosate. It's a good post-emergent contact killer. It's a lot safer for the vine than glyphosate. So once we get past the dormant stage and we get much active growth of the vine and get further into the season, we get away from glyphosate and we swing into some of these other materials that give us the protection. Keep in mind that with glyphosate is that the more mature the vine is, or the more subject it is to damage by glyphosate. Most products are going to be at their maximum susceptibility to glyphosate when you approach bloom and afterwards. And in fact, if you look in peach at the label for Roundup, the label will state not to use it after bloom. And the reason for that is the potential damage to the crop you're trying to protect is going to be a lot higher. So a lot of different materials. We're using paint mixes in the materials. So in the right conditions, you can put out a pre-emergent and a post-emergent material at the same time and get longer term protection. But from a year-round standpoint, if you're looking at chemical weed control, we might use the glyphosate early in the year. We could use it as a fall cleanup after the plant's dormant. But we can also use it in the winter or early spring to clean up winter weeds. Go into the season with the bare ground underneath the vines, which is what we'd like, because it's going to give us better air circulation, give us a measure of frost control, as well as reduce the competition for moisture and nutrients. Then after the glyphosate is no longer working, and we're starting to get escapes come in on up into the spring, we'll come back with a pre-emergence plus a post-emergence paint mix to give us summer control and on up into the fall of the year. And a lot of times, once the vines get more leafed out, more foliage, more vigor, the shading from the vine is going to help control some of that vegetation as well as the herbicide. And then we'll go up through the summer. If necessary, we'll come in the fall for a fall cleanup to knock out vegetation that may be an issue as we go into the winter. So you're not going to find any herbicides that at the recommended rate are going to give you full season control. That just isn't going to happen. But there are different selections that we can make at different times of the year to give us pretty good control with multiple applications. I want to say a little bit about using backpacks versus other types of weed sprayers. A lot of us with the small vineyards are using backpacks to not only to spray the weed control products, but also to spray the vines. And that brings up an issue. You can use the same sprayer. However, some materials don't wash out real well. And cleaning up the sprayer when you go from an herbicide to, say, a fungicide is important so you don't get plant damage. Also, we talked about nozzles earlier on. If you were using your backpack for weed control, ideally you'd have a flat fan nozzle that would be better for weed control. But when you went in to spray the foliage of the vine, it would be for your benefit to change to a different nozzle, to go to a hollow cone that would give you better coverage for fungicides and insecticides. Another thing to look at with backpack is that as a rule, when we put out sprays in a backpack, we're going to overdo it. We're going to put more gallons per acre out than what you think you are. And so when I mix herbicides in the backpack, I tend to favor the lower range of the recommended rate for product, realizing I'm probably putting more gallons down on that per acre basis than what I would with the other types of sprayers. And that way I can stay within the recommended rate per treated acre more easily. Some of the new backpacks are solving a lot of these problems. I mean, some of them are battery powered and have constant pressure, so you're not having to continually pump, and you either have pressure that's too low or too high. You can set them at a given pressure and they'll maintain that for you. Some of them have cadence counters, so that with a little practice and timing yourself and running a few practice runs, you can actually do a decent job calibrating a backpack. So, if you're looking for a new sprayer, but it's still going to be a backpack, there are some pretty nice ones on the market. The next step up I see a lot of times are these small sprayers that have an electric pump, and they're used a lot on ATVs, or might slip it in the back, you pick up and run it. They'll do a nice job within the limit. That is, they'll work fairly well on liquid formulations of some of these materials, but when it comes into wettable powders, they tend to fall down. They're not, they don't run, they don't agitate very well in the tank. And that's one of the characteristics that we're looking at is agitation within the tank to keep that spray mixture or solution agitated and fairly uniform throughout the tank. If you, and I might point out on some of the new backpacks, they actually have some agitation in the tank that some of the older ones did not have. So, but anyhow, the electric sprayers, like I say, they do a fairly decent job on some of the liquid materials, which would disperse and stay in solution better. But a wettable powder, a lot of times settling is going to be an issue, and you're not putting out uniform rates, or you may have issues putting it out with blockage of the nozzles and so on because of the settling of the product in the tank. With any herbicide, with any sprayer, the best recommendation we can give you is when you mix up the spray solution, go put it out right then. Don't mix it up before lunch and let the tank sit there for an hour or so before you go out to spray. If you do that, make sure you got a sprayer that's got good agitation in the tank, and you give it a chance to bring that spray solution back up to where you don't have problems with higher rates once you get towards the empty tank. To me, the best, a good weed sprayer for a commercial vineyard is one that uses a roller pump. Roller pumps work well at low pressures. But realize that a roller pump using wettable powders is going to wear out. The rollers will over time get worn to the point that they won't maintain the pressure like they used to. The hoses that you use on the tank are on herbicides, don't need to accommodate a lot of pressure, but you need to have pressure hoses that will accommodate whatever pressure you're spraying at. Good agitation in the tank. The best agitation is a mechanical agitator in the tank. Fill that tank up half or more full with water and then add your product after the tank is uh, over half full, and have agitation going at the time you introduce the herbicide into the tank so that you don't have any settling. And like I said earlier, once you get the herbicide mixed up, get ready to go to the field right then and then put it out. That'll give you the best results. Now, I've covered a lot of different things. Hopefully, it's been a benefit to you. One reference that I wanted to point out, and hopefully most of you already know about it, but University of Tennessee is one of 9 southeastern universities that make up the Southern Region Small Fruit Consortium. And every year, we publish cultural guides for the major small fruit crops. So we're doing bunch grapes, muscadine grapes, blackberries, blueberries, whatever. And in that, we've published a spray program. So if you go online to www.smallfruits.org, that'll put you on the homepage for the Small Fruit Consortium. Up at the top of the page, you'll see several headings. Click on IPM/production guides, and it'll bring up the different crops that we deal with. Select bunch grapes, and it'll take you into the recommended spray program for that year for insecticides, fungicides, and herbicides. These products, we revise it every year, and so within reason, they're up to date, and the products listed are going to be legal ones to use. We can run into issues. I already mentioned about surfland being unavailable. That occurred after the revisions to the guide were made. But for the most part, that's going to give you access to the most up-to-date information we've got as far as what to use, the rate to use it, and the information on correct usage of that product. So with that, I wanted to keep a little bit of time for discussion and questions. If there is any, I'll try to entertain them. Feel free to ask me if you've got questions, and also any suggestions you might have on areas that I've overlooked, or other areas you might like to see addressed. I'm sure we'd like to know about those as well. So, is there anything that bring up?
I have a question.
Okay.
This is Kerry Cox. Hi, Dr. Lockwood. I was early in the program, you were talking about sod between the rows, and the various issues. If you've got a current sod or whatever, green growth between the vines that we mow, is there can you overseed that with something and without having to cultivate it? And if you were to overseed it with something, what would you do that with?
Yeah, you could. I'd be analogous to going into a pasture, and you could go in and strip that sod. A couple things that you do, and you bring up a real good point, Terry, because we talked a lot about weed control, but it's almost always going to be like under the vines or under the trees, and we don't talk about the middle of row, that sod or grass strip. And so you can go back in. First off, you can kill out with selective herbicides. You can kill out broadleaves in that sod strip if that's an issue. If they're going to come back, if you're going to address a good grass cover, and so seeding into that could be a way to go about it. Another thing we look at is we fertilize our grapevines every year. So how many times do we fertilize that grass between the rows? And one of the benefits of a good sod is that it will shade out a lot of the broadleaves. And so over time, even if you started off with a good coverage, a good sod mat that would give us some protection from broadleaves, over time, by not fertilizing, by not addressing the needs of that sod, the sod gets weaker. We get more sunlight hitting the ground. We get more weed seeds germinating and successfully growing in that row middle. So by keeping that sod healthy, keeping a fairly dense covered grass, we're going to accomplish a lot of broadleaf weed control right there. As far as the actual overseeding or strip seeding, that's something I want to talk to you a little bit more about. Individual basis, because it's more of a generalization depending on what you find. But yeah, you can go in and strip seed those row middles, and primarily in the fall of the year would be the best time to do it.
Thank you, sir.
Mm-hmm. Something else too, and mentioned, talked a little bit about fertilization, but over time, we don't pay enough attention to soil pH in that row middle as well as under the vines. We want to keep that pH, up above 6, primarily 6.5 for vinifera, but that vegetation on the ground has a preferred pH range too. And it's not unheard of that the pH will get out of the desired range for that sod, and therefore it's becoming less aggressive as a result. And correcting that can be another way to get on top of some of the problems that lose the control of that ground cover. Any other questions?
Dr. Lockwood, this is JD. I've got a question. It's kind of off the subject. It's been on my mind for the last couple of years. Fire ants. I know that maybe it's not the time to talk about it. I'd love to talk to you afterwards, or maybe somebody else has questions about that. But what can we use?
Yeah, and that's something, JD, I would like to talk to you about, because I need to bone up on this too. There are some products out there to use, but there are also some fire ant materials out there that are not labeled for use in the vineyard, that we need to make sure that we're not getting in trouble that way. So that's an area I'd like to get together with you, and maybe that's something that would merit putting together something to put out for the small fertilizer to actually to put online with the material Adam put that for us.
That'd be great. I would appreciate that. Absolutely.
Yeah, we'll try to develop that, and I'll make a note on that JD fire ant. Okay.
Thank you, sir. Good to see you.
Good seeing you too. Anything else? Got a few more minutes left if you want. Anybody know any good jokes? One of the things, as we go along, please, if you come up with questions or whatever, holler at us or funnel it through your extension agent or email me, holler at me. I mean, I look forward to hearing from you, but it also is a real good way to kind of keep up and kind of jog my memory, just like JD did right now. So please don't hesitate to get in touch with me. Hopefully, I won't let you down. I'll be able to provide some information that'll be beneficial.
I have a question.
Yes, sir.
This JD has already taken us off subject. Have they relabeled Manzate?
To my knowledge, it's still 66 days. Well,
No, I'm not talking about that part of it. I'm talking about the diseases that it's labeled against. It looks to me, I just looked at it, I hadn't studied it yet. Looks to me like they've reduced the diseases that it's labeled against.
well,
If I said that right.
yeah, and that could possibly be. I know I've read, and it's not too long ago. I read an article that Manzate was one of the things that EVDC materials in general were one of our kind of safe products that resistance development was not going to be a major concern. I did see a report relatively recently where they're starting to see it in some areas. So,
Some resistance to, okay, to manzate.
yes, sir. So that may be what's going on. Also, it may have something to do just with the hurdles that they run into as far as relabeling or maintaining labels on products. I don't know.
Thank you, sir.
I'll see. Zach Hansen is our pathologist, and I'll try to ask him and see what I can find out on that too. You know, there are some like music like Catan. If you got some of those products that are fairly broad spectrum in their control, resistance development is not that likely, and they have a real important part in our pest control program to keep the more specific materials viable for us over a longer period of time. So it's important to see what's going on there.
Thank you.
Thanks for bringing that up.
Any more questions? Okay. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Lockwood. I think this went really well.
Thank you, especially for letting me get this thing up to start off with.
We will be sending out the recording for everyone as well, so you can get the if you had to hop on late or had to jump off early, you guys can get the full thing. And just a reminder that next week we are going to be doing the State of the Industry of Sonoma. Not next week. Next month is April 13th, same time, which is 11:30 Central, 12:30 Eastern. And we will send out a reminder and everything like that. And yeah, looks like you're getting a lot of thanks in the chat. So lots of people are really thankful to hear from you. But yeah, that's it. I hope everyone has a good rest of your day, and we will see you in a month. Bye.
Thank you, Emily.
Absolutely. Bye.
Take care, everybody.